Welcome, everyone, to a special edition of the Financial Sense News Hour. Conspiracies, are they real? And if so, how would you prove it? Is there a difference between a conspiracy and maybe a long-term agenda? You know, many governments and foundations seem to operate on long-term agendas. And by the way, if an agenda operates in plain view, is it still a conspiracy, or is it maybe an open conspiracy, like Marilyn Ferguson said in her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy? By popular demand, we're bringing back our annual series of interviews featuring much more conspiratorial views than we're accustomed to on the Financial Sense News Hour. Here's Jim Poplava.
Dr. Dennis Cuddy joins us next on the program. Dennis has testified before members of Congress on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice. He has also authored and edited 20 books and booklets. He has written hundreds of articles appearing in newspapers around the nation, including the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and USA Today. He's also been on CBS Night Watch. Dennis, I think a lot of Americans, as they look back over the last probably 10 or 11 years, we've seen a series of extraordinary events. We were led to believe, for example, in the 90s that we were entering a new economic paradigm that would lead us all to financial paradise. You didn't have to make profits, technology. Then we got the tech boom. We got the events of 9/11. And then after 9/11, we saw interest rates go down to the lowest that they've been in half a century. Things were back to a boom. Real estate prices were going up. The average American was able to buy a home. And then all of a sudden, we got the financial crisis. Major companies went under. The government responded with levels of spending we have never seen in our decade. So as you put all this in perspective, there seems to be, in my opinion, a sequence of events that have been orchestrated because none of the perpetrators of the financial crisis are in jail as they were in the S&L crisis. In fact, they walked away with multi-million-dollar bonuses. Major investment banks like Goldman Sachs were bailed out dollar for dollar, just as it was portrayed in The Inside Job. The big fat cats got away, and it seems like we have capitalism during good times and socialism during bad times.
Well, yeah, and the direction is from a larger plan. I call them the power elite, and what they do is, as you said, they use crises, and they use the crises to generally increase debts. This began in the 1600s, and when the Bank of England was established, it was primarily for that purpose. They never stated that, but they got the Bank of England in debt very, very quickly in the 1690s, and that was by design. And then, of course, they want the colonists to be in debt. When we started printing our own currency here, Ben Franklin said the revolution was really over that as much as anything else, that the British didn't want us to do that. And there was a literal plan. The Second Bank of the U.S. and Jackson's fight over that had a lot to do with that. The deliberate plan by, as I call them, the power elite to split the nation in two was by design. There's an 1809 letter to that effect, and then an 1861 letter by our minister to Vienna. He had uncovered what he called a conspiracy to do that. And then there's another item by Otto von Bismarck talking about that from over in Europe, looking back across the ocean to the U.S., And so what you had, there are a number of these groups. One of them is Cecil Rhodes' Secret Society, the Society of the Elect, and he had two principal aims. He wanted to absorb the wealth of the world, and then he called it a scheme to take the government of the whole world. And he would use certain, not all, but certain Rhodes scholars to do that. As you said, in the recent times, Franklin Raines, for example, seems to get away scot-free. He was a Rhodes scholar, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and then he walks clear. And other individuals similarly had the same thing happen to them, and it usually comes through some crisis, something that is used to increase the debt, which has increased recently exponentially. They will deliberately have a plan, as you said, the power elite, to move us towards socialism, sort of a synthesis of Western capitalism and Eastern communism into a world socialist government, but they have to move each nation, including the U.S., in that direction, and that's why President Obama was very important, taking over Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, General Motors, and others. And so, yeah, that's the sequence that they use, and the general plan is to eventually to get to this world government. The first step, of course, would be to have a global currency. So they had to get us in debt, meaning they will have to devalue the dollar. They'll be through inflation and other means. And the current situation is to move here in 2011 from special drawing rights to what's called World Order Currency Units, WOCU. Each nation is going to print them up. Some nations have already started, Italy and others. But then that won't be sufficient either. And so the scheduled timetable for the world currency is 2018. You can actually see a picture of that on the cover of The Economist magazine, January 9th, 1988. And it says, pencil in the Phoenix, the world currency for 2018. And in the last 2 years, there have been 2 financial ministers' conference or global currency conferences saying they're still on track for 2018. So that's the goal.
Dennis, if they're trying to achieve a global currency, that would imply a global central bank,
right,
and also a global government. Now, if we look at what's going on in Europe today, they tried a sort of European currency, and they do have a European central bank, but they do not have political unity. In other words, no country can act independently with monetary policy, and they don't have the fiscal means to, I guess, raise taxes. So how does this work? Because it doesn't look like it's working in Europe right now.
There's a multifaceted approach. As Zbigniew Brzezinski said, they're not going to get to the world. He said this in the first State of the World Forum in 1995. He said they're not going to get to the world government with one quick leap. It'll be regional groupings at first. So you already have ASEAN, you have the European Union, you have NAFTA, and so on. They're in the process, and that's what these so-called spontaneous revolutions, which really aren't, in the Middle East, is to set up the stage, an economic crisis, a revolutionary crisis for use the carrot and stick approach, that they will all be very cooperative, including Israel, and they will be taken into a what's called a Mediterranean Union. It's already established, but it hasn't been operational yet. That's why Milosevic had to go. He was a block towards the linkage between Europe, the European Union, and this future Mediterranean Union that they were creating. The people, of course, are reluctant. They don't want it. The Americans don't want a world currency. But as I said, through economic arrangements, in effect, we almost have something like a world government through the World Trade Organization. I think about 75, 80% of their decisions have gone against us, and they have literally forced our Congress to change our laws. So to some extent, you have these unelected bureaucrats with the World Trade Organization dictating trade policy. Then you throw in a global economic crisis, defaults of certain nations, Greece and others, and so forth. And then reluctantly, the people, through these economic crises, will say, okay, this global economy has to be managed by something, and that entity will become, not immediately. Like I said, you got about 7 years before you have the global currency, and then that'll be operational for about 7 more years. So that by 2025, what will happen is the management of the world economy will take on the look of a global government.
Dennis, if we are to go to a global currency, it'll be because the value of existing currencies have fallen or become even worthless.
Right.
And we've had inflation. How would they get the world to accept another, let's say, another fiat currency when it was shown that all of these fiat currencies failed? I mean, why would people trust a new currency?
Well, the people really aren't going to have anything to say about it. They're creating, it's sort of like Orwell's book 1984, where normally you would reject certain things, but in the end, as O'Brien, Big Brother's agent, told Winston, you will come to love Big Brother. They really won't have a choice. It may not even be a fiat currency in the sense we know it. They may actually create some sort of solid, backing for it. It really doesn't matter. But the people won't have a choice. They will literally, there are certain books written about this. There's one called Post-War Worlds back in 1942, which said they would control trade practices, migration practices. In fact, I think they said they will control the global currency at the time. and so forth. And so you will come to love Big Brother because you will literally be dependent upon them. It's sort of like in the 1930s in this country. People were willing to accept the definitely socialistic move that FDR was going through, not because they liked it necessarily, but they really didn't have a choice. They were standing in bread lines. Unemployment went up. Inflation was up. And so it's not so much a matter of the people saying, I choose this even though I don't want it. Two things will happen. They'll be basically coerced. They always use coercion at first. They try coercion so that it appears that you voluntarily do certain things. Now, you may say, well, I personally would never go for that. But what happens is, let's take an instance, and I wrote about this back in the 1990s, looking into the future, saying what was going to happen. And I said, okay, how would they tell you what you can eat and where you can go and do this sort of thing? And because people say, no, the government's not going to do that. So what they did, and I predicted this, and it's happened, is they will say, well, we're going to increase your insurance premiums. Now, we won't increase it as much if you eat this certain diet and do this certain exercise routine and so forth. And so the people voluntarily say, okay, I'll do it. It's my choice to do what you tell me to do. And so they'll try that at first. And like I said, it may not even be a fiat currency as we know it now, but you really won't have any choice. It's just that the public will sort of come to love Big Brother.
Dennis, one of the things that has struck me throughout the financial crises is we tend to see the same players move in and out of each new administration.
Right.
For example, in the 90s, in the Clinton administration, you had Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and Alan Greenspan who were moving to deregulate the financial markets, get rid of Glass-Steagall, which allowed the banks to buy investment banks, that's the money center banks, that is. And then also there was a move to deregulate derivatives, especially the over-the-counter derivatives, and then also a move to block regulation of derivatives by Brooksley Born. And as a result, they allowed the investment banks to go from 12-to-1 leverage to 40-to-1 leverage, and anybody in their right mind, and especially I would think financial regulators, would know that if you let somebody go from 12-to-1 leverage to 40-to-1 leverage, you're going to have a problem. So we ended up in this financial crisis that we've been in since 2007 and 2008, and then we get a new president, and the same people that were behind the deregulation, Summers, Geithner, we see the same people show up, Gensler from Goldman Sachs, are now the same people that are telling us they're there to fix it.
Yeah, they created a problem, so they're the best ones to supposedly fix it, but they never do. As you said, and I wrote about this some time in the past, that anybody in their right mind who allows leveraging to go from 12-to-1 to 40-1 knows that at some point there's going to be a crisis, a housing crisis, mortgage crisis, whatever it is. So right there, you know that what this is planned. Also, their change, as you indicated, allowing foreign ownership of American companies. If you look at certain industries, they're like 67% electronics industries. In fact, a majority of the major industries really aren't even owned here. They may have an American name on them, but they're owned by some company or corporation in the Netherlands or Britain or somewhere else. And that was important because they have no real loyalty to American citizens. It's just like a plant here closing in Idaho because they can get a better deal in Michigan. Their attitude is the same thing. They don't mind at all putting a lot of Americans out of work and shifting a factory over to Bangladesh or somewhere. Also, there's the international pressure. That's why the Bank for International Settlements was really created through the Hague Agreement back in the 1930s. And that's the central bank of all the world's central banks. And there have even been articles in the Washington Post saying, in effect, how these guys basically, by their policies, control the world's economy. And a new book that I've got coming out called The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan, that plays a part in this. A lot of people think that the Nazis are dead and gone, but they really weren't. The power elite has used them as a sort of sub part of their plan. And the idea was that while the Allies were winning the war, Second World War militarily, the Nazis, which means National Socialism, that's the important part of this, that it's National Socialism, that they're moving the U.S. and other countries who still aren't socialist in that direction. That's why that's important. Very briefly, Bormann, the party chief, by 1943 had $180 billion at his disposal with 2 years to go, which is about $2-3 trillion in today's terms, to literally, and he did, take over about 750 corporations around the world. And they would send their elite people who could pass as Egyptian, Iranians, Americans, all over the world to have ownership, patent rights, copyrights, trademarks. They would own them, and they also get front men so that you may think this particular Argentinian